Okay, today we're going to look at what's called a pedigree. So a pedigree is a visual chart that depicts a family's history or the transmission of a specific trait. Okay, so this is what geneticists will look at, or genetic counselors will look at, and try to guide families, especially families that are known to carry a genetic disorder. They'll use pedigrees to explain to families the likelihood of them having a child that will have that genetic disorder. So pedigree is a visual chart that depicts a family history or the transmission of a specific trait. They can be interesting to view and can be important tools to determine the pattern of inheritance of specific traits. Pedigrees are used primarily by genetic counselors to help couples decide to have children when there is evidence of a genetically inherited disorder in one or both families. They are also used in trying to determine the predisposition of someone to carry a hereditary disease. For example, familial breast cancer. So there are mutations that can be passed along in your genes that can predispose family members to having breast cancer. And it can also affect males as well, and usually it's more like sometimes breast cancer. Males can also get breast cancer, and also what's known as prostate cancer can also be related to genes that are cause breast cancer in females. So it can be passed on through the family. Okay, so in a pedigree, a circle represents a female, so that would be a female. A square represents a male. The vertical lines that connect brackets between parents and child, so these would be the parents, and this line's connecting them down to these would be their children. Okay, so a horizontal line is going to connect a male and female in a marriage. So this is a marriage between the husband and wife here. This would be a marriage. The parents gave birth to these children. 1, 2, 3 children. Okay, this is not a child of those parents, and this is not a child of those parents. This would be a daughter-in-law. This would be their son, and then the son married this female. So this was their marriage, and then they had children. So this generation would be children of this generation, would be grandchildren of this generation. And usually you'll see them numbered. This would be generation 1, generation 2, generation 3, and then sometimes it'll be labeled person 1, person 2, person 3, and so on. And then this daughter married this man, and they had these children. And the ones that are shaded represent the people that are carrying, or that actually have that particular trait that we are looking at. So the ones that are shaded have that trait. It may be a genetic disorder. It may just be a trait that we're looking at. Okay. So a horizontal line represents the marriage. Vertical lines represent the children, parents connecting to the children. A circle or square that's not shaded indicates that that person does not express the trait we're looking at. So the ones that are not shaded do not have whatever that trait might be that we're looking at. The ones that are shaded do have that trait. Okay. In this case, this is for white forelock. You may have seen someone that has a little a patch of white in their hair. Okay. So in this case, this mom did not have the white forelock. This dad did. And they gave birth to 3 children. 2 out of their 3 children have that trait, and this daughter does not have that trait. Okay. And then this daughter who had the trait married a man without the trait. They had 2 children who have the trait and 1 that does not. Some have the trait, some do not. Okay. And right here, both of these parents have the trait. They have a child who has a trait, and they have a child who does not have the trait. Okay, right here's where it gets interesting. It doesn't tell us if this trait is dominant or recessive, but we can tell a lot when we have 2 parents that have the trait. If they have children who do have the trait and children who do not have the trait. Well, if this were a recessive trait, then if both of these parents have the trait, we'll say if it's little f, for forelock. If it was a recessive trait, this person would have to be little f, and this person would have to be little f, which means mom only has little f's to pass on, and dad only has little f's to pass on, which would be okay when we get to this child, because he also has the trait, so he could have been little f. But if they only have little f's to pass on, then that would have to be a homozygous recessive, but then you have this child right here who does not have the trait. So that tells us that this cannot be a recessive trait, because if it were a recessive trait and both parents had it, they would have to pass it on to their children. This child did not get it. So this must be a dominant trait. So we can figure that out just from knowing that these two parents had the trait and then they had a child that did not. We now know that it must be a dominant trait. So now we can remember the test cross that we talked about. So if it's a dominant trait, then Dad has that dominant trait. Okay, so he has that dominant trait. So we're going to say that he is, we know that he has that dominant trait, so he would have a big F. That's all we know about him. But if Mom doesn't have that trait and it's dominant, then we know that Mom over here is little f, little f. Okay? So now we're going places. So if Mom is little f, then she only has little f's to give. Okay. So she had to give this child a little f, but he has the trait, and we just determined that it's a dominant trait. So this is like a test cross. If he has a trait, we know that he has to have at least one of those big F's. So Mom had to give a little f, but then we have daughter right here. Daughter right here does not have the trait. Okay, so we know Mom gave a little f, but if she doesn't have the trait, then she has to be little f, because being normal is recessive. She has to be little f, little f. Mom gave a little f, so she had to get another little f from Dad. We know Dad gave this child a big F, and now we know that Dad had to give this child a little f because we have some had the trait, some did not. So that's back to those test crosses we were talking about. Some had the trait, some did not. So Mom gave a little f, but Dad also had to give a little f to this child. So that means Dad up here was big F, little f. Okay, and it's a dominant trait. We know right here in this case, we know Mom had to give a little f, and this one had to get a big F from Dad. So that's Dad's big F, and then Mom's little f. So we know that so far. Okay. And this person does not have the traits. This person who does have it, but she's heterozygous for it. She's a female. She's a circle. Marry this man who has a recessive condition of normal hair, so he's little f, little f. This one doesn't have it, so this one has to be little f, little f. Okay. This one does have it, so Mom had to give this one the big F, and the Daddy can only give the little f, and same thing with this one. Mom had to give this one a big F. It has a big F from somewhere. Dad only had little F's to give, so Mom had to give it a big F, and Dad gave it a little F. Okay. Over here, we knew that this offspring was big F, little f. And then we know that they married somebody who has at least one big F because they have that trait, or she has that trait. This child has to have at least one big F because this child has the trait. But we don't know for sure if it has, it could have got a big F from Mom and a big F from Dad, so it could be big F, big F. We also know that Dad did have a little f, so Mom could have given a big F and Dad could have given a little f. So that could be big little. So all we know is that it has at least one big F. This one again has that recessive trait of normal hair, so this one we know would have to be little f, little f. We can tell all that just by looking at that. Nobody had to tell us if it was dominant or recessive or who had what. We can figure all that out just by paying attention to the patterns of inheritance. And that's what pedigrees do. Okay, so let's scroll down and see what it asks down here. So squares are used to indicate males in the family. Circles are used to indicate females. If an individual is affected by the trait, then that individual will be shaded in. Again, lines between males and females shows that they are married, and then the line going down shows that connects them to their children, and this would be their children. You notice that line between siblings is up like that. And then if this one were married, they would have a line going over here, and then the person that it's married to. So sometimes you'll see some shapes filled in halfway. Sometimes you'll see something that looks like that, and that would be a carrier. That would mean they have one dominant allele and one recessive allele would be what that would mean. Don't usually see that, but occasionally you might. That's what it would mean if you see a shape that is half shaded is that that person is a carrier of whatever trait we're looking for. So analyzing simple pedigrees. A pedigree is just like a family tree, except that it focuses on a specific genetic trait. A pedigree usually only shows the phenotypes of the family members. With a little thought and hints below, you will be able to determine the genotype of each family member as well, and that's what we just used to figure those out. If an individual is homozygous recessive, then both parents must have at least one recessive allele, because they would have had to have gotten one of those from mom and one from dad. If an individual shows the dominant trait, then at least one parent had to give them a dominant allele. So one parent would have to have that dominant phenotype. If both parents are homozygous recessive, all they can give is that recessive allele. So then all of their offspring would also be homozygous recessive. So note, in a pedigree, a trait of interest can be dominant or recessive. The majority of harmful genetic conditions are only seen when an individual is homozygous recessive. And that's caused usually, if they're detrimental, then and they're dominant, then that usually tends to die off in the population. But the majority of harmful genetic conditions are only seen in an individual with homozygous recessive. Examples of the condition by recessive alleles include cystic fibrosis, it's a disease of the secretory glands, including those that make mucus and make you sweat. Fanconi anemia is a blood disorder that's recessive. Albinism, lack of pigmentation. Phenylketonuria is a metabolic disorder. PKU, they test babies for that when they're born. So genetic conditions are caused by dominant alleles and may therefore be expressed in the homozygous, dominant, or heterozygous individuals. For example, conditions that are dominant alleles, polydactyly, having extra fingers. We talked about polydactyly cats a little while back. Polydactyly is having extra fingers, and that's actually a dominant trait. Achondroplasia, which is a type of dwarfism, is dominant. Neurofibromatosis is a nervous disorder. It damages the nerve fibers. It is a dominant trait. Diseases known as familial hypercholesterolemia, having high cholesterol, it's genetically inherited, is a dominant trait, in which affected individuals suffer from heart disease due to abnormally high cholesterol levels. So for questions 1 through 9, we're going to use the pedigree chart shown. It's shown below, but it's actually right here beside it. Some of the labels may be used more than once. So a male, an example of a male would be, remember, squares are male. Remember that because males are usually boxier, females are usually curvier. So the curvy circles are females, the boxy squares are males. So C would be a male. A female would be A. A marriage is the line that connects the male and female there. B would be a marriage. A person who expresses the trait, okay, that's anybody who's shaded in. The one that's labeled, that would be A. These would also express the trait. So A is the one that's labeled that expresses the trait. Someone who's shaded and showing that trait. A person who does not express the trait. The ones that are not shaded do not express whatever trait we're looking at. In this case, it would be C. A connection between parent and offspring. And that'd be the ones that go down and across. So D is showing those connections between parent and offspring. And how many generations are shown in this chart? Well, that's generation 1, generation 2, generation 3. So there are 3 generations shown on this chart. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. In part 2, we will look at the questions below.